All right, good morning. um, Welcome you to yet another class as we continue to look at theories in ethics as it pertains to this course, Education and Professional Ethics. Remember, I said that we need to have an understanding of these theories before now we venture into the major area of profession ethics and teaching ethics in particular. So we need to understand, therefore, why people behave the way they behave, so that we may have actually an idea of why people get into such situations of right and wrong. So basically, what we have so far looked at, we have looked at a few ethical theories. Started with egoism. Remember, we said that when we talk about egoism, we are talking about a theory that suggests that man is naturally personal in nature, and that most of what we do as human beings in most cases are based on our personal interest. And we said that basically egoism has two features, has two types: psychological egoism, specifically the egoism, that aspect that describes how people actually behave, right? And then we also talked about normative egoism, that describes how people should actually behave. So that was the first type of theory that we looked at, and then we looked at, remember, we looked at relativism, and that we discussed that relativism can actually be seen in two sides, what we call subjective relativism and also cultural relativism. And then when we talked about subjective relativism, we made mention here that basically this theory suggests that there are no universal no morals of right and wrong, and that basically all persons decide wrong and right for themselves. Okay, and in most cases, these decisions may not be based on reason per se, right? And we also looked at some of the cons and the pros for that. And then we talked about cultural relativism, where we say that this is basically an ethical theory that suggests that what's right or wrong basically depends on the place or the time at which an individual actually finds himself. So this is a theory that suggests that, you know, our right and wrong is dependent on where situations find us, or circumstances per se. Okay? And then we looked at Kantianism, where we said actually this is a theory that emanates from Immanuel Kant's beliefs about morals. And we said, remember, that Kantianism suggests that people's wills should be based on moral rules, that we already have adequate moral rules that are in place as human beings. And so when we want to behave in a certain way, we must behave based on those moral rules that have been set by society. And basically that it's important that our actions are actually based on appropriate moral rules. Okay? So Kantianism says to determine when a moral rule is appropriate, we need to emphasize on what Immanuel Kant talked about, talked in terms of categorical imperative. Okay? And categorical imperative, we said, remember, that it has two formulations. The first formulation is that when we engage ourselves in an act only from moral rules that you can at the same time universalize. That if you have to engage yourself in a rule of some kind, a moral rule, it must be a universal type of moral rule that everyone else actually will accept as the right or the wrong, right? So if you act on the moral rule, that would cause problems. If anyone followed it, then your actions are not more acceptable. Okay, so the first formulation of Kantianism suggests that all that which we do as human beings, it must be based on what is accepted by the majority of society. If the majority of society said, complain about your action, then there's a problem with that particular action. The second formulation of the categorical imperative, according to Immanuel Kant, is that when we act so that we should always treat both ourselves and other people as ends in themselves, and not really, never only as means to an end. So therefore, if you use people for your own benefit, according to Immanuel Kant, that is not moral. That is actually not moral. And then we looked at some of the pros and the cons for this, for Kantianism, in which we we discussed actually in detail. Then the fourth theory that we looked at, remember, we looked at existentialism, and we basically said that existentialism is a philosophical belief that states that as human beings, we are each responsible for creating purpose or meaning in our own lives. Okay? So it's an individual aspect that you and I are able, each of us are responsible for creating purpose. Not only purpose, but also meaning in our own lives. So our individual purpose and meaning is not given to us by God in any way. It's not given to us by governments. It's not given to us by teachers or other authorities that we may talk about, right? And remember we said that important in that account, therefore, are the claims that when we talk about moral values are created rather than discovered. And that moral responsibility is actually more extensive than usually measured. And that moral life should never be a matter of actually following rules. Okay? So each one of us, according to existentialism, has an innate behavior that should give us a leeway to make meaning out of what we believe as human beings. And then we talked about utilitarianism, a theory that we said is based basically on one's ability to predict the consequences of an action. So when you want to engage into an action as a human being, you must be able to predict, to say, when I engage myself in this particular action, what will be the consequences, both as an individual, and what may be the consequences for my family, my church, my classmates, or the society at large. Now, this theory, to a utilitarian, the choice that yields the greatest benefit to the most people is the one that is ethically correct. So even if you have a desire to engage in an action that you think is best for you, as long as that desire does not yield the greatest benefit to most people, then it is not ethically correct. Okay? And we said, remember, that there are basically two types of utilitarianism. We talked about act utilitarianism and also rule utilitarianism. And when we talk about act utilitarianism, this actually describes precisely to the definition of what the theory is all about. That a person performs the act that benefit the most people, regardless of personal feelings or the societal constraints, such as laws that may be put in place by human beings. So basically, utilitarianism describes a person who performs the acts that benefit the most people other than himself. While on the other hand, when we talk about rule utilitarianism, it takes into account the role and is concerned with fairness. That even if you are, you have a desire to do what you want to do, if the law says this is not right, for the sake of fairness, so that each one actually is okay with whatever belief that you have, your whatever action, then that's fair for everyone. So a rule utilitarian seeks to benefit the most people, but through the fairness and most just means available. Right? If you are a teacher, therefore, when you talk about a rule utilitarianism, we are saying that, okay, in case you receive a funeral as a teacher, no matter who died, right, and then you are actually the key person at the school for an event that should actually take place, for the sake of fairness and justice, so that students do not lose, sometimes you may as well be able to suspend whatever the family funeral could be. All right. Therefore, there are added benefits of this rule utilitarianism, being that it values justice and includes beneficence at the same time when you actually act upon it. Right? Now, there's what we call moral worthy of an action. And that when we talk about moral worth of an action, basically this is determined by its outcome. Okay? When we talk about moral worth, if an action is moral worthy, we are talking about, at the end of it all, what is its ultimate action. Okay? So this particular, as I said earlier on, this particular theory is basically a moral philosophy, generally operating on the principle that utility, okay, it comes from the word utility. Now, utility, which it can be in terms of happiness or satisfaction of different people, can only be measured but also meaningfully summed over people. So people are basically the most important aspect of this particular theory. It tries to maximize the well-being of society and emphasizes what will provide the most benefits to the largest group of people. And in a school system, will be actually involved in a number of these aspects that will call upon you as a teacher to involve yourself beyond what your personal interests actually are for the benefit of the school, right? So that's what we can talk about, that theory. The next theory that we discuss is deontology. Now, the deontological class of ethical theories basically states that, that people should adhere to their obligations and also to their duties, especially when engaged in a decision making when ethics are at play, right? So basically, when we talk about deontology, we're talking about obligations that we actually have as human beings. Now, this means that a person will follow his or her obligations to another individual or to another society. Why? Because upholding one's duty is what is considered ethically what? Correct. Now, when you are employed as a teacher, one of the forms that you are going to fill in, there is a statement that will actually read that I will be deployed where my services are needed. So if you are deployed to Shangwangbo, you should not complain because that's what you signed for, right? That's your obligation. That is your duty. You actually trained as a teacher to be able to teach anywhere as long as there are students in that particular place, right? For instance, again, a deontologist will always keep his promises to a friend and will follow the law as it actually states. So a person who adheres to deontological theory basically will produce very consistent decisions, since they will be based on the individual's set duties, right? So basically, you when you are a deontologist, when you believe in this type of theory, when you act deontologically, you are likely to produce very consistent decisions. People will be able to tell that when this person is faced with a situation, he or she is capable of going this other way. They know how consistent you actually are, because they know that you follow the set duties that pertain to your profession, right? Then we move on to the other theory, what is known as hedonism, right? Now, the word hedonism basically comes from the ancient Greek meaning pleasure, right? So psychological or motivational hedonism basically claim that only pleasure or pain motivates us. What did I say? Hedonism suggests that only pain or pleasure motivates us to engage into an action, right? Now, ethical or evaluative hedonism also claims that only pleasure has worth or value, and only pain or displeasure has disvalue or the opposite of value. So basically, when we talk about hedonism, this is the belief that pleasure or the absence of pain is the most important principle in determining the morality of a potential cause of an action. You have heard of a phrase in Tonga, Gigisa urajo, right? Chisata chamene alinacho. I don't know if I'm speaking, I'm using correct Eastern language here. But basically, this theory suggests that naturally a human being will act the right way when he has no pain, right? And when he's enjoying his fullest life. And that sometimes people engage into actions that may not be favorable because of pain. We have seen people who are actually true Christians, elders, and they pray for the sick. But when these people actually get sick themselves, sometimes they force themselves to go to the ngangas, because they may believe that something strange may be happening to them in terms of spiritualism, right? So what is it that forces them? It is the pain. But when they are okay without pain, they may not engage into those immoral issues, right? Now, basically, what we call as intrinsic hedonism suggests that the creation of pleasure for all people is the best way to measure if an action is actually ethical. The creation of pleasure for all people, right? Okay, so basically that's what we can say about that, about hedonism. The other theory, ethical theory, is what we call naturalism. And Others call it virtual theory. Now, naturalism in ethics suggests that what is good is a function in some way of the way things are. Okay? Right. Let's take, for instance, pleasure or the fulfillment of human nature, our obligations to humanity. All right? Now, this natural law theory suggests that basically moral law is based on human nature. Okay? Natural rights theory, human rights are essentially for our functioning as human beings. While when we talk about virtual ethics, these are ethics that emphasize good habits. Those character traits that you and I have that enable us to function well as human beings. Sometimes it could be that we have learned of these good habits from our church, sometimes from our family, sometimes from our friends, or sometimes we make our own. Right? So this theory suggests that a virtuous person is a morally good person. Examples of virtue ethics includes, I remember Nawa made mention of honesty as one of the characteristics of ethics last time we met. So these are examples of virtues. Loyalty, when you are not able to, to disappoint others. Or honesty, right? And we can say that the opposite of virtue are such vices like when you are stingy, that's an opposite virtue of, of virtue ethics. Basically, their primary goal is to do good rather than to be good. That's the primary goal of virtue ethics. So virtue ethics stresses the ideal way for persons to be and not just to act. So we must be able to predict your action as a human being when you are faced with the circumstances. We should not be thinking of, we don't know how he's going to behave. We must be able to, according to virtual ethics, human beings create their own characters. You have heard of people say, that man is honest. That man is kind. They predict what you are able to do when you are called upon. So moral life, therefore, is about developing good character. I call upon you that as you engage yourself in the teaching profession, you must be a predictable person. When students find you in class, they should be able to say, even when a student is late, they should be able to know what you are able to do. But remember, all that which you should do should be for the benefit of the student, the benefit for the school, the benefit of society at large. It's about developing good character. Right? So determining ideals for one's life, therefore, and trying to embody these ideals is one's life. And I want you to take note that basically when we talk about virtual ethics, the originator of this particular type of theory is Aristotle himself. I told you last time that you should read some of these guys. They have said a lot about ethics. Aristotle talks a lot about virtual ethics. Right. From virtual ethics, we talk about contractualism. This is another theory, ethical theory. Now, contractualism suggests that individuals basically are motivated both by self-regard and by respect for others. Did you get that? Contractualism suggests that individuals are motivated both by self-regard, not only by self-regard, but also by respect for others. What do we mean by this? Right. Now, since each person is partly motivated by concern for her or no, her own interests, as we saw it in egoism, contractualism can ground consequentialist reasons. What are we saying? Therefore, what we are saying is that moral principles are grounded in the idea of living with others. Living with others on terms of mutual respect. There are people who are not respective. Right? So contractualism suggests that moral principles basically are grounded in the idea of you and I living with others in terms of mutual respect. So when you think about mutual respect, think about contractualism. So the moral theory of contractualism claims that moral norms basically derive their normative force from the idea of contract or mutual agreement. Respect me and I'll respect you. That's the basis. And in most cases, people who follow this type of theory are quite skeptical of basically the possibility of grounding morality or political authority in either divine will or even in perfectionist idea of humanity, basically the nature of humanity. Okay, so basically that's what we can talk about contractualism. Okay, the other theory is the divine command theory. Very, very important, especially that we are getting a degree from a Christian perspective. We need to understand what it is that divine command ethical theory suggests. Now, divine command theory is basically religious in nature. What does it suggest? Now, religion as we see it is often considered the most widely used system to make ethical decisions. If I asked you a number of things that makes you behave the way you behave, you as a class member in this class, most likely you base it on the Bible, on your religious background, right? Okay, and so basically when we talk about the divine command theory, it puts the religion, all right, as the most widely used system to make ethical decisions and also to conduct moral reasoning. Now, this particular theory, as indicated as divine command, it is from God's commands that actions are determined to be right or wrong. And because of this, divine command theory provides an objective assessment of what is ethical or moral. So throughout the world, you and I would agree that people rely on a variety of religious beliefs, a variety of religions, to help them determine the most ethical action that they want to take. Now, while divine command theory is widely used throughout the world, that in most cases our actions are based on our religious beliefs. Although people rely on these religious to help them determine the most ethical action to take. There is much to that. Okay? So while divine theory is widely used throughout the world, there are also differences in that. How? Because religious beliefs differ one from the other. We are all religious, whether we are Muslim, Islam, Christianity, or whatever we are. So even in terms of what is right and wrong in those particular religion is dependent on our belief systems. So the application of the theory may differ from religion to religion, but it may also differ within each religion. Even among the SDA's church, where I am here, there are things that they don't agree upon, that no, an SDA as an Adventist cannot do this. For instance, you cannot go in church in Africa, in most African countries, as a lady in a trouser. But in this part of the world where I am, you are able to do that. Right? So, one of the basic tenets for the divine theory, divine command theory, is actually to use God as the source of all the principles, all the rules that govern our actions. Right? So, in this way, to rely upon divine command theory, you as a person must believe that there is a willful and rational God that has provided the direction towards an ethical outcome. So it is basically from God's commands, according to this theory, that actions are determined. How? Whether they are right or they are wrong. And because of this, divine command theory provides an objective assessment of what is ethical or moral. But get this, however, in this particular theory, there are a number of ambiguities in the way in which some scripture may be interpreted, even in the same church, the same religion. Take note that even among Christians, we differ on how we take some things, and that's why people, one congregation, one church worships on Sunday and the other on Sabbath, because we differ in how we interpret scripture. And even in terms of morals, it's possibly likely that we'll actually differ. So, according to studies that have been conducted about the divine command theory, there are basically 4 assumptions of the divine command theory. 4. Number 1, the first assumption when you think about the divine command theory is that they always think that there is a God. That's assumption number 1. There is a what? There is a God. A God who gives directives on how you actually must behave. Number 2, the second assumption is that God commands and forbids certain actions, certain acts. Even in the Bible, there are things in terms of food that God said, this you can eat and this you cannot eat. Here, this you can behave, this you cannot behave. So, the second assumption is that particular God who exists in assumption number 1 gives commands and also forbids certain acts. Number 3 assumption is that an action is right if God commands it. Therefore, if he doesn't command it, then that action is wrong. And the 4th assumption is that people are certain what God commands or forbids. They are certain. Okay? They are able to say, this God said no. This one, he said yes. Okay? So, this divine command theory also provides an explanation on why ethics and morality are so important. If you are a Christian, I know before you graduate, you'll be doing a course called Integration of Faith and Learning. So much so that when you get into the field, you are able to distinguish what knowledge you must be able to impart based on your Christian values and Christian beliefs. So, in religions, good acts, according to the divine command theory, good acts are rewarded in the afterlife. You know that when you do good, even if you die, preachers and the Bible tell you that God will come and resurrect you. So according to some religions, when you are engaged in good acts, there is a reward to that, even when you die in the afterlife. While bad acts condemn the perpetrator to an everlasting punishment. And we know that. So what it essentially makes religion such as incredibly powerful ethical system is that there is the spectra of a potentially eternal punishment in the afterlife. Sometimes, therefore, according to the divine command theory, people will engage in right actions because they want to benefit in the afterlife. Others who engage in the right action because they want to run away from a potential internal punishment in the afterlife. Okay? So this notion of eventual punishment, therefore, reinforces in its followers the necessity to make ethical decisions based on the commands of that particular God. Okay? Now, there are others also who have described that understanding God's will is actually done in three ways. Number one, through individual consciousness. That sometimes, even if you don't need to read the Bible, your conscience should be able to tell you that the right action for this particular incident is this. Number two, by religious authorities. Remember, as Christians, sometimes we run to these authorities for wisdom. We may have the Bible, but there are people who may explain the Bible through, better, and also through the Holy Scriptures, per se. Right? So, what are the pros for the divine command theories, the advantages? Among the advantages is that basically we owe obedience to God, our Creator. If you believe that you have been created, then we owe that obedience. Even when we engage into in an action of whether good or bad to our fellow human beings, we are doing it for God. So if you engage yourself in a bad action towards a brother, then you are injuring God. Remember, Jesus said, for as much as you have done good to anyone, you have done good to me, and vice versa. The other advantage is that God is all good and all knowing. If you are a Christian, you believe that. And then the other one is that God is the ultimate authority. If God is the ultimate authority, therefore all the actions that we do must be based on the fact that we are there to please Him as our Creator. But there are also disadvantages or cons for the divine command theory. Among them is that there are many holy books that disagree with each other. That creates a lot of, problems. And you hear when someone moves from one church to the other, they'll say, in my church, they used to refuse us to do this and this and this, So the fact that there are many books, create a lot of disagreements and problems among people. In a multicultural society, it's unrealistic to adopt a religious-based morality. When you find yourself in a multicultural where there are whites, there are blacks, the Indians, there are people from within Africa in different countries, sometimes it may be very difficult to adopt a religious-based morality. Because the Adventists of Zambia may be different from Adventists here where I am, and different from the UK, from Canada. There are things culturally that we take. I know that when you go to Swaziland, even